Assalamu alaikum and good evening. Viewers, it's a huge setback for American President Barack Obama that Russian President Vladimir Putin said a potential strike by the United States against Syria would increase violence in the Middle East and destabilize the global system of international law and order. Though he seems pretty convinced even on this dilemma that poisonous gas sarin was used in Syria, referring the August 21st chemical attack that the U.S. says killed over 1,000 Syrian civilians. Putin added that there is every reason to believe it was used not by the Syrian army, but by opposition forces to provoke intervention by their powerful foreign patrons who would be siding with the fundamentalists. And now, when Syria is ready to hand over its chemical weapons to the international control, earlier he denied of using chemical weapons against civilians. Is he under pressure of anyone? Is there any other power behind all this, as this is now an international issue which will ultimately affect whole Muslim world as well as the consequences of U.S. attack? If it happens, will it be massive? I would like to ask a question here. Don't you think that America's been too war weary? According to an analysis report, majority of Americans are against this violent activity. Moreover, major stakeholders are also against it. And let me tell you an interesting fact here, that Obama was elected again by American people because of his anti-war policies. And look what Mr. Barack Obama is trying to prove again now. Here are many facts that need our attention today. First, towards which direction this Syria-US conflict is taking the entire world. Second, what will be the stance of Pakistan government over this situation? Is another third world war going to happen as warned by many analysts? Is America making another excuse of chemical weapons in order to fulfill his own benefits? For all these questions, we would like to analyze the situation, and for that we have Mr. Zaid Hamid in studios with us. Assalamu alaikum, Zaid Hamid, and thank you for joining us. As you can see that we are talking about Middle East situation today in our show, and before we start our show, we would like to have a look at a report that we have prepared according to the Syrian situation. Once we are updated after that report, then we will continue our discussion.
President Barack Obama has put military action against Syria on hold and vowed to pursue diplomacy to remove the regime's chemical weapons. The U.S. had threatened strikes after a gas attack killed 1,429 people in Damascus on 21st August. The U.S. holds the Syrian government responsible for a chemical attack in Damascus. The Syrian government blames the attack on rebels. Russian President Vladimir Putin has called Washington to pursue diplomacy rather than use force. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has reportedly accepted a Russian proposal to put its chemical weapon under international control to avoid a U.S. military strike. The United States has reportedly started funneling weapons and technical equipment to rebel fighters in Syria.
Yes, Zaid Hamid Saab, as you can see that we are focusing on Middle East situation today in our show. So tell us first that what's happening in Middle East right now.
You see, let me give you slightly background perspective of what's happening today. When we talk of Middle East, we are actually talking about the Muslim world, because the entire Middle East actually consists of every country in the Middle East except Israel, which is an artificial entity planted in 1948. But before that, every country in the Middle East is actually a Muslim nation. So Middle East is actually a Muslim. What we are actually talking about is the heartland of Muslim world. And what is happening in the heartland of Muslim world?
Right.
After the First World War, 100 years ago, when the present maps of the Muslim world were redrawn, the countries that you see today, Iraq, as a nation state before the First World War, they were all part of the Ottoman Empire. And when the Ottoman Empire was dismembered after the First World War, these maps were drawn by those powers which had won the war, the Britain, France, and all these allied states. And actually, on a piece of paper, the Ottoman Empire was carved out into different lands where the Syria mandate was given to the French, where the Iraqis and Saudi Arabia, these mandates were given to the British, Palestine was given to the British. So the Muslim world was actually divided, dismembered. It was broken down into smaller nation states and divided within the victorious powers. This happened about 100 years ago, and nobody talks about it today. But the fact is that whatever is happening now, after 100 years, is exactly a repeat of what happened in 1918 after the First World War. Muslim world is being divided again. The large Muslim countries are being dismembered. They have been broken down into smaller, ethnic-based or sectarian-based nation states. The same powers which fought and won the First World War are now back again into the Muslim Middle East.
Okay.
For so many reasons, which we are going to explain later in this program. You see, about the grand strategic objectives of the global powers, let us remind you something is that normally the grand strategic objectives are extremely simple and very short and well defined. To achieve those grand strategic objectives, the information war, political war, diplomatic war, military wars are waged to achieve those grand strategic objectives which the powerful nations define for themselves. They had decided before the First World War that they want to dismember the Ottoman Empire and divide the Muslim world completely within themselves. First World War was an excuse. It was apparently fought in Europe, but the biggest victim of that First World War was the Muslim world. After the First World War, it was the British Empire that wrote to the Lord Rothschild that British Empire has agreed to grant the mandate of Palestine to a state of Israel. Okay. That means the creation of Israel was mandated after the First World War. Why? War was fought in Europe. Muslims did not ignite it. Why would the state of Israel be created in the Muslim heartland and created by the British Empire as a punishment to Muslims?
So you're saying that they came up with an excuse to penetrate into the Muslim world, and that's why Israel was placed
This is precisely what we are saying. First World War had different objectives, and one of them was to create the state of Israel. And the Balfour Declaration defines it very clearly. The letter written by the British government is available now. It was sent to the Lord Rothschilds, agreeing that now the British Empire will create a homeland, create an illegitimate state of Israel within the Muslim heartland for all times to come, as they assume. Now, it was the state of Israel which could not be created after the First World War. So they needed another war to achieve it, the Second World War. And once the Second World War achieved, you would realize two ideologically driven states were created. One was Pakistan, which was created after the Second World War, which was based on Islamic ideology. And the second ideologically driven state based on Jewish ideology was created as the state of Israel, 1948. Immediately Pakistan and Israel are almost born at the same time.
Almost. So both 65 years old.
Almost, and both ideological opponents of each other, both ideologically driven states. The only states in the world which are ideologically driven, Israel and Pakistan. So, to create the state of Israel, they needed two world wars. After the First World War, they agreed to create it, they worked towards it, they could not achieve it, needed a Second World War, and then immediately after the Second War, the state of Israel was created. So, what we are coming back now is that the present anarchy and chaos that you see from Afghanistan to Morocco, the greater Middle East as they call it, that's the greater Muslim world. And every country is in turmoil today. So what's going on? Is this the movement for democracy? Is this internal civil wars or upheavals within the Muslim civilization, with Muslim societies against their own rulers and dictators?
But then Zaid Hamid Sahab, again, if we can blame the external factors that they are working to exploit the Muslim world in Middle East, then what about the Muslim countries among themselves? Why aren't they united?
We are coming to that now. Let us first define the 6 grand strategic objectives of the US foreign policy for the 21st century. Once you understand that, you will understand this complex jigsaw puzzle, not just in the Middle East, not just in the Muslim world, in fact, across the entire world. In 1998, American Enterprise Institute, a think tank run by evangelical Christian Zionists like Paul Wolfowitz, like Dick Cheney, like Condoleezza Rice, George Bush, This is the cabal which is ruling the America for the last 20 years now. And they are the foreign policy makers. They are the ones who wage wars. They rule, they control the industrial empire, military industrial empire complex of the American establishment of the American government. They are the ones who are formulating the US foreign policies. They are the ones who are actually waging all these wars in the greater Middle East, in the world today. In 1998, the American Enterprise Institute wrote a policy paper called the Project for New American Century. All these documents are now available on the internet. You can Google them, you can find them.
All right.
The Project for New American Century actually defined that in the 21st century, what would US have to do to remain a dominant power for the 21st century? That was the objective. That was the defined goal of that Enterprise Institute's policy paper, the Project
for... How can US be the superpower?
How can US remain the superpower
Okay.
for the 21st century also? Because 20th century was basically a Cold War period. Americans and Soviets, basically the Cold War was there, both the countries faced off each other, and there were two major global powers. The world was divided into two major blocks, the Soviet bloc and the American bloc. But in the 90s, after the Soviet-Afghan war, you saw the disintegration of the Soviet Union.
Right. So
and
America
then for a brief
accomplished
period,
by disintegrating
exactly,
Russia.
for a brief period, America emerged as the sole superpower of the world. You must have heard the term that unipolar world has emerged. You see, a world with one pole. Initially, there were two poles, Soviets and the Americans. So Americans, in the 90s, they started applying various doctrines in the world, experimenting with how to remain a dominant superpower for the 21st century also. So the American Enterprise Institute chalks out the entire strategy and vision for the US foreign policy for the 21st century. We would recommend every listener to go and pick up that document from Google and go through it. It's stunning. It's mind-boggling. And it clearly shows that how the world is going to be reshaped, how the world is going to be changed. So much, huge amount of killing will be done, maps will be redrawn, countries will be dismembered, just to achieve one objective, the US dominance in the 21st century. But this dominance within itself has 6 grand strategic objectives, which I'm going to define to you now. The first and the foremost objective of the US foreign policy is the defense and security of Israel. That's point 1. America would go to any limit to defend and protect the state of Israel, which means not just protecting Israel, but also destroying the large Muslim countries which are around Israel, dismembering them, denuclearizing every Muslim country. No Muslim country would be allowed to keep nuclear weapons, because that becomes a threat to Israel. That's why you find the Iraqi nuclear program destroyed. That's why you find the Libyan nuclear program destroyed. That's why you find them after Pakistan.
We can be next.
We are next.
Okay.
That's why they're after Pakistan's nuclear program also. So defense and security of Israel is the first strategic objective of US foreign policy for the 21st century. And to achieve this end, they'll go to any extreme. That's their...
So what you're saying is that when they enter the 21st century, do you think that they might have planned 9/11 in US, the terrorist attack?
The American Enterprise Institute report, the Project for New American Century, actually mentions this, that to convince our nation that we need a world war, we need to go into different countries, we need to dismember different countries, we need a Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor, again referring to the Second World War event in which the Japanese had attacked the American naval base, which ignited the American nation into joining the Second World War. Otherwise, the Americans were not coming for the Second World War. It was a war being fought in the Europe or in the Asia Pacific. But the Pearl Harbor ignited the American nation. And the Project for New American Century actually mentions this, that we need a Pearl Harbor, which of course came in the form of 9/11 Twin Tower attacks. So the first objective is defense and security of Israel. The second objective is control of global fuel assets. You see the war about oil and gas. The entire war that you're seeing today is for control of fuel resources. Now the Iraq's fuel resources, the Libyan fuel resources, the Saudi Arabian fuel resources, the fuel resources in the Arabian Gulf, the fuel resources in the Mediterranean, the fuel resources which the Russians have. The future of the world depends on who controls the oil and gas resources. So the second grand strategic objective is control the world global supply of energy. The third strategic objective is to control the global waterways, trading routes, and the pipeline routes. You see, it's a very interesting fact. Pick up the map, open it up, have a look. The entire Muslim world sits on the waterways which are the bottlenecks for the world trading. start from Gibraltar. Gibraltar is next to the North Africa Muslim world. Muslim world, if they want, the North African countries, they can choke Gibraltar. Just a small strait, the global trading goes through it. Okay. Come to Suez. Suez is controlled by Egypt. Come to Bosphorus, that's controlled by Turkey. Come to Arabian Gulf, that's controlled by Iran and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries. Come to Malacca Straits, again passes through Indonesia, that's again Muslim lands. So every global waterway is around Muslim land. That's why the Americans went into Somalia also, because around that region, around the Red Sea, you find that bottleneck where nowadays you have this piracy thing.
Right.
So what we are saying is, also the war in Middle East was about the pipelines. Who would control the future pipelines going into Europe, going towards the so-called Western world? The present war, we'll come in detail, is actually about the pipelines. The Afghan war was about the pipeline. The Taliban regime was removed because of a pipeline agreement, because Taliban refused to sign it with Unicol, an American company, and gave the contract to Bridas, an Argentinian company. And the Americans wanted to bring a Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, TAPI gas pipeline, which Taliban refused to cooperate in. That's why the regime was changed, and Karzai was brought in, who was incidentally a consultant to Unicol also. So third objective is, that was the third objective, control of defense and security of Israel. Second is control of fuel assets. Third is the control of the trading routes, waterways, pipeline routes. That's the strategic objective for which they have to be present in the Muslim Middle East to control all these routes. The fourth objective is to control and destroy the concept of political Islam. That is what you are seeing in Egypt right now, because that democratically elected government was overthrown through a military coup, and Americans are very comfortable with the dictatorship there. Americans are very comfortable with overthrowing of a politically elected democratic government, just because that government happened to be an Islamic government, just because that government happened to be from Akhwan al-Muslimun, the Muslim Brotherhood.
Again, the question raises here is that who is U.S. to interfere in a country's internal tasks?
We will come to that.
Why is U.S. considered as the decision-making factor?
You have asked a very interesting point, and we'll come to that. Let me just complete those 6 grand strategic objectives. We've done 4 now.
Sure.
Control of political Islam is another strategic objective. You would remember that in the 91 and 92, in the last century, in Algeria also the same thing happened. An Islamic government came of FIS, FIS, a democratically elected government, but then a military overthrow, took place in Algeria also, and the world stayed silent. There was no talk about democracy or dictatorship at that time, because the government, politically, democratically elected government, happened to be an Islamic government. And the 4th grand strategic objective is the containment of Russia, that Russia must not be allowed to emerge as a future superpower in the 21st century. It was a power in the 20th century, but Americans do not want them to rise as a future superpower in the 21st century. So containment of Russia is a very critical objective. And the containment of China, that's the 6th grand strategic objective. Okay. So whatever you're seeing in the Middle East, and in fact in the entire world today, is to achieve these 6 grand strategic objectives. Whatever wars you see, the wars to take over the country, to dismember the countries, to control the fuel assets, to control the pipeline routes, to control Malacca Straits or Arabian Gulf, or to control the Suez Canal, or control the Gibraltar or Bosphorus, everything that you see today is circling around these grand strategic objectives. It flows from these grand strategic objectives.
Okay, Zaid Hamid sahab, it's time for a short... Welcome back, viewers. We are talking on the Middle East situation as to what's happening now in Syria. Viewers, if we analyze since 9/11, in the past 12 years after the 9/11 attack, this terrorism has escalated in Middle East world. America has made a reason to attack Afghanistan after the 9/11 attack. Then it approached Iraq for the weapons of mass destruction being there. And at the end of the day, they couldn't find anything. Anyway, we will start our discussion again with Mr. Zaid Hamid. We have him here. Before we start our discussion, Zaid Sahab, we have a sword in which we would like to see that what's Barack Obama, US President, saying on 9/11 just a couple of days ago regarding the Syria situation. Let's have a look at that, and then we will get back to our discussion.
No one disputes that chemical weapons were used in Syria, and that is why, after careful deliberation, I determined that it is in the national security interests of the United States to respond to the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons through a targeted military strike. The Russian government has indicated a willingness to join with the international community in pushing Assad to give up his chemical weapons. I have therefore asked the leaders of Congress to postpone a vote to authorize the use of force while we pursue this diplomatic path.
Yes, Zaid Hamid, as you saw Barack Obama saying that it's in the national interest to pursue in the direction of Syria for the usage of chemical weapons. We will get to this part as well. You can explain us the history that brought us here, where we are standing today.
You see, what we have discussed so far is that Muslim world was dismembered and broken down about 100 years ago as well, after the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire was dismembered and these present maps were drawn. So we are used to this phenomenon in the Middle East, that the dominant powers, when they feel like it, they break down Muslim lands, redraw their maps, divide their resources and control their leadership. This is something that we have seen has been happening for the last 100 years within the Muslim world, and now the whole phenomena is being repeated. What happens is, and we have also discussed this, is that American Enterprise Institute, the institute which is run by the neocons, and it's very important here that we discuss who are the neocons, because
who are these neocons that we hear about?
Exactly. Without identifying and understanding the mentality and the mindset of the neocons, you will never understand what is America doing in the Muslim world. Why are they doing so much of killing? Why they have defined those 6 grand strategic objectives for themselves? You see, neocon is apparently a Christian sect. I'm saying it apparently. Why? But if I make it very easy for you, neocons are actually Zionist Jews in Christian uniform. I mean, to put it very simply, this seems very weird, seems very strange, but this is exactly what it is.
Neocons, it's Zionist Jewish Christian form?
They are Zionist Jews wearing Christian uniforms, basically appearing as good Christians, but they're actually serving the interest of the Zionist Jews.
Okay.
And the belief that they are a religious cult, they have religious belief, they have a belief that the state of Israel must be strengthened, must be expanded, must be developed, must be protected. No Christian in the last 2000 years of Christian history had this belief. This is a new cult which has emerged, which is actually going against the standard values, standard beliefs, standard faith of Christianity. Christianity is in matter of principle is a peace-loving religion, but evangelical Christian Zionists are actually, that's why they are called Christian Zionists, because they are following, protecting, defending, expanding the ideology and agenda of the Jewish Zionists, the ones who are running the state of Israel. That's why defense and protection of Israel is the first agenda of the US foreign policy today. For the last 20 years primarily, since the time of Bush 1, when they waged the first Gulf War, since that time, American foreign policy is totally dominated, totally controlled by evangelical Christian Zionists. And this religious cult, which appears to be Christians, but in fact, as we said, are Zionist Jews behaving, pretending to be Christians, are the ones who are actually destroying the world today.
So, Zaid Hamid, I'm trying to understand here that, okay, we get the fact that they're done with Russia. Now, this century, they're focusing on Muslim world to disintegrate that. And after 9/11, they're done with Afghanistan, they're done with Iraq. Egypt is done. Now it's Syria's turn. So what's the ultimate goal? What do they want?
See, Syria is again, the 6 objectives that we defined. Let's pick them one by one. By destroying Iraq, by destroying Syria, by destroying Egypt, basically what they do is all major countries which were on the neighborhood of Israel are destroyed, dismantled. They're broken down into smaller, dysfunctional, headless, failed states, meaning thereby they are not a threat to the state of Israel, which is a nuclear armed weapon state. You see, what the Americans have is 3 strategies in front of them to achieve the objectives which they want. One is called the Somalia strategy. The Somalia strategy is you go into a country, you destroy it, you come out and leave the country in a mess, a headless, dysfunctional, failed state. Americans went into Somalia in the early 90s, destroyed it, came out, and now the Somalia today is a functional example of how failed states work. And this is one strategy that the Americans have. They go in, they destroy the country, they come out, make a mess of it. The second strategy which the Americans are deploying is called the Iraq strategy, in which they go and occupy the land. They invaded Iraq, they occupied the land, they're present there, and then by being there, they exploit the ethnic and religious divides between Shias and Sunnis, between Arabs and Kurds, divide the country further by being there.
They keep them busy in their internal problems, so those countries cannot stabilize.
And functionally, Iraq is a headless state even today. It's almost divided into three major segments. Kurdistan is separate, Sunni Iraq and Shia Iraq is almost divided, and they're fighting amongst each other, and the presence of the Americans or the puppet regime on top is just to make sure that Iraq stays like this. Despite the fact that there's no high-intensity conflict going on in Iraq, Iraq remains in a state of urban, decentralized, asymmetric war. 30 or 40, almost you can say dozens of suicide bombings takes place every week, every month. Hundreds of people are killed every month. And Iraq is in a mess. The world's largest oil-producing country does not have oil for its people. The people are absolutely destroyed. This is called the urban fourth generation war. This is the kind of war which they are waging in the Muslim world now. That's the second option.
So they did this to Iraq. So you're saying that the biggest, largest oil-producing country is in its internal mess. Let's come to Afghanistan. What's going to happen there? They are evacuating in 2014. NATO allies would be leaving that land, Afghanistan. So what do you see is going to happen there?
Before I come to this, just need to conclude. The third option that the Americans plan to do with various Muslim countries is called the Yugoslavia option. You see what they did in Yugoslavia, 1992 and 95, that last century. Yugoslavia was largest pro-Soviet Union country in the heart of Europe. But within 3 years, Yugoslavia disintegrated into 5 or 6 different countries. What happened? Americans ignited ethnic wars, religious wars in Yugoslavia. And after 3 years, NATO went in, they bombed Yugoslavia back to Stone Age, forced the combatants to on a table and signed the Dayton Peace Agreement, which basically decided the fate of Yugoslavia, broke down Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia does not exist as a state, as a nation, as a country anymore, and divided into multiple Kosovo, Bosnia, Croatia, Montenegro, different countries, Serbia.
Right.
It's divided. So these three options that the Americans would use in every Muslim land, either it's going to be Somalia option or Iraq option or Yugoslavia option. So in Afghanistan, which you're saying now, what Americans did is they went in. But there's a difference between Iraq and Afghanistan. In Iraq, they did not find that much of a resistance which they are finding in Afghanistan. Afghanistan has been a graveyard of empires for centuries. Alexander couldn't control it. British Empire couldn't control it. Soviets couldn't control it. Americans wouldn't be able to control it, and they have not been able to. And now the Indians are planning to go, and we welcome them there because it's been a long time. We have not seen a graveyard of Indian empire somewhere.
They will get beaten up bad. I hope so.
We are looking forward to that.
Right.
So, but the point is that Americans have been defeated in Afghanistan. They have to evacuate. But keep one thing in mind. They evacuated from Somalia also. But what did they leave behind? A mess. And this is exactly what the Americans plan to leave in Afghanistan also. Exploiting the ethnic frictions between Pashtuns and Tajiks and Uzbeks and Hazaras, Americans would first try to convince the minority communities of Uzbeks and Tajiks and Hazaras that you need us, you need the American presence in Afghanistan to protect you against Pakistan-backed Taliban. This is the pitch that they are going to sell first. And if it works, Americans will leave a rear guard behind. A small force would remain in Afghanistan. But if this pitch doesn't work, if the Uzbeks and Tajiks say, no, we don't want foreign forces, we'll settle our scores with the Pashtun Taliban, their own countrymen, we will find some way to coexist with them, then the Americans will be forced to leave Afghanistan. But before that, they do that, all their military hardware, all their weapons, all their ammunition, all their equipment will be distributed within different ethnic communities, ethnic groups, warlords, gangs, terrorist groups in Pakistan. It will actually be distributed. And this is what is happening. Americans on paper are saying that they are leaving behind $37 billion worth of military hardware, which will be destroyed according to them. Basically means no record. All records will be destroyed.
Distributed.
That will be distributed
among all those
all the militant groups in the entire region. So when the Americans leave, the country becomes...
Then Zaid Hamid, isn't it better that everybody should have a peace talk, and these people within Afghanistan and Pakistan, they can have peace talks with each other? And if they can get the unity among themselves, then a third factor can exploit them.
The solutions are many. This is something that Pakistan, Iran, Turkey and Afghan groups have to sit, and China and Russia, of course, have to sit together. And we have to decide that the mess that the Americans are leaving within the heartland of Central Asia, which is not just a Muslim heartland, a heartland of Central Asia also, which affects China and Russia directly as well. So this is something that is of interest, great interest of all these neighboring regional countries, and they have to take charge of the destiny of Afghanistan to decide what kind of future Afghanistan should have. Should be a peaceful future, should be a future which should not be spreading violence and terrorism into the entire, from Central Asia, from Chinese Turkestan to Central Asia to Iran to Pakistan. No country in the region wants terrorism to emerge out of Afghanistan. But when the Americans leave, you can be sure that they are going to leave behind a bloody mess. And this is something that the Americans are planning now. This is exactly what they're doing in Pakistan. All the insurgent and terrorist groups in Pakistan are using NATO weapons. They are using NATO-supplied weapons. And so this is something that Pakistan Army has officially acknowledged. Pakistan's ministries and government departments have officially acknowledged. The terrorists that have been captured are found to be using NATO weapons, and we know what Americans are planning. Let me take
a break here, Zaid Hamid Saab, and then we will come back and we will individually analyze the situation of Syria and Egypt, and then we will go to Iran and Saudi factor as well in all this crisis. Now, you can stay with us. We'll be right back after a short break.
आप इस वक्त इस
Welcome back, viewers. We're talking on the Middle East crisis. Specifically, we're trying to focus on Syria crisis. As of now, meetings between U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and Russian foreign ministers in Geneva are happening, and they will continue till next week on a possible military strike, if it happens on Syria or not, how to resolve it through a political grounds. Let's hope that it does get resolved through politically instead of having a military strike. But before we get back to our discussion, we would like to see what John Kerry has to say on Syrian issue and what David Cameron has to face in his own parliament on the military strike call. Let's have a look at that, and then we will get back to our discussion.
We're waiting for that proposal, but we're not waiting for long. President Obama will take a hard look at it, but it has to be swift, it has to be real, it has to be verifiable. It cannot be a delaying tactic. And if the United Nations Security Council seeks to be the vehicle to make it happen, that cannot be allowed to simply become a debating society.
I have a very strong view that we need to take a tough and robust approach around the world to an appalling war crime that's taken place in Syria. But I'm also a Democrat who believes in consulting and listening to Parliament. And I think I've set out those steps in a very deliberate and careful way. But we have to listen to Parliament. Parliament spoke. And Parliament, I think, made a very clear view, which it doesn't want British involvement in military action. So we will proceed to have a strong view, to put a strong principled case, and then to listen to Parliament. I'm determined as a Prime Minister to do things in a different way, to done it, consulted, and to listen to the result. I haven't spoken to him since the debate and the vote, but I'd expect to speak to him over the next day or so. I don't think it's a question of having to apologise. I think it's a question of saying to a fellow Democrat, a fellow person, well, but I think that's the point. Look, I was faced with three things I wanted to do right and do in the right way. First of all, to condemn absolutely and respond properly to an appalling war crime that took place in Syria. Secondly, to work with our strongest and most important ally, the United States, who've made a request for British help. And thirdly, to act as a Democrat, to act in a different way to previous Prime Ministers and properly consult Parliament. Now, I wanted to do all of those three things. That, obviously, politics is difficult. It wouldn't, of course, that involved going to Parliament, making an argument in a strong and principled way, but then listening to Parliament. I think the American public, the American people, and President Obama will understand that.
Yes, Zaid Hamid Saab, as you saw, John Kerry and David Cameron, giving out their perspectives. But I have a question after listening to their statements, that don't you think that globally things are changing? It's not easy for them this time to strike Syria as it was when it was Libya. And I would also like to know that how Syria different than Libya, but we can continue from where we left.
You see, Syria is a very interesting case in the Middle East, and a genuine crisis for the Crusaders, if I use the word. Because this is the word that the Bush used when they launched this world war after 9/11. He actually used the word that crusade would now be launched within the Muslim world. And it was not an accidental slippage of tongue. They actually meant it. Syria, again, as we said, is an extremely interesting case. There's another term that we'd like to introduce here, that's called Pipelinistan. Pipelinistan. all the Muslim lands are normally called Istan in the end. Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, Kazakhstan,
Right.
Turkmenistan, Pakistan, you see. So from there they have coined a new term, Pipelineistan. Yani a country, a land from where the pipelines would pass. And interestingly, all energy, oil and gas pipelines pass through Muslim lands. And when Russia wants to export gas to Europe, which is a $500 billion per year market, we are talking about big money here. We are talking about huge future potential of who controls Europe's fuel energy market. And every gas pipeline which these regions want to push to Europe goes through Syria. That makes Syria very interesting. The Russian firm Gazprom, which had already signed agreements and deals with Syrian government to push gas pipelines into Turkey, from Turkey to Europe, is obviously offended by the fact that the Western powers, Saudis, Qataris, they want to replace Gazprom with a government in Syria which would be pro-Saudis, pro-Qataris and pro-West and pro-Israel. And this is actually the reason for conflict in Syria. It's a war for pipelines.
It's the war for pipelines. So I need to know, Zaid Hamid, what's the catch for Russia in supporting Syria? And what's the catch for China in supporting Syria?
You see, this is the point what we are saying.
And then what's the problem of Saudi with Syria?
You see, the problem is, it's a very complex ground situation which is being exploited by global and regional powers. These Russians want to push their gas pipeline through Syria. Iranians want to push their gas pipeline through Syria. Fine enough. But Saudis and Qataris also want to push their gas pipeline through Syria. Israel does not have a gas pipeline going through Syria to Europe. Israel has its own independent gas reserves found in the Mediterranean, which they want to sell to the European market as well, but they can take it through the sea. They don't need Syria. So Israel does not want any country to use the Syrian land. Israel does not want Russia, Israel does not want Iran or Qatar or even Saudi Arabia to push their gas lines through Syria. So in Israel's interest, it is that Syria must remain in turmoil, must remain in chaos, must remain dismembered, broken down in a state of civil war. So no country can benefit from Syria, while Israel can push its gas pipeline to Europe, $500 billion per year market. And Israel in the process gains land, it will expand its borders, it will extend its territory, and at the same time remove a major threat of a Muslim country in its neighborhood like Syria, because Syria in the past has been a major problem for Israelis. No war in the Middle East could be won, could be fought without the Syrian contribution, and now when Syria itself is in a civil war, Israel is the net beneficiary. All other countries want friendly governments in Damascus. Russia wants Bashar al-Assad to stay, Iran wants Bashar al-Assad to stay, Qataris and Saudis want Bashar al-Assad to go, and a Sunni government come. Interestingly, Bashar is Shia also. And this makes the war, gives a sectarian dimension as well. The sectarian wars within the Muslim world...
When we have approached the Bashar al-Assad's regime, I want to know that how was his regime? How was he, as a leader of Syria?
Bashar, Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi were Baathists. They're all communists, they're all seculars, liberals, pro-Russians, and actually anti-Islamic. And all of them have been very secular, very harsh, very brutal regimes who have been killing their own citizens. There have been no permission for dissent, no permission for difference of opinion. Actually, they are brutal regimes. There is no doubt about that.
So that's how the civil war began in Syria, you see, due to Bashar al-Assad's strict regime?
It's not just that. You see, again, please try to understand. Saddam Hussein was a brutal man. There is no doubt about this. He was a cruel man. He was a very, very harsh and brutal dictator and a secular and a pro-Russian. But when he exploited on the sectarian Shia-Sunni card, and he was given full backing by the West and the Saudis to stop the Iranian revolution. For 10 years, Iraq fought against Iran in the Iran-Iraq Gulf War, which actually ignited the sectarian wars in the entire Muslim world. At that time, Saddam Hussein was an ally, a friend of the West, of the Americans. After the Iran-Iraq war, when Saddam became so strong, so became arrogant, so became powerful, that he annexed Kuwait as well, assuming that now he can do it and the Americans will back him up. That backfired completely. Then the Saudis and the Americans actually joined to destroy him in the first Gulf War and later on in the second Gulf War and ultimately hanged him. So this geopolitics is complex. Sometimes a same dictator can be a very useful idiot for the Americans, and then when his retirement program starts, he is normally...
He becomes a threat to them. And that's when they destroy them.
Well, we call them the CIA's retirement program. So when they use it, when they use a useful idiot, when his useful life is done, when his shelf life is over, they either hang him or kill him, just like they killed Gaddafi as well.
Okay. So now we are hearing that U.S. is providing weapons to the rebels in Syria. So they are pumping those rebels in Syria against Bashar al-Assad.
Now you will understand. Okay, this is the Yugoslavia doctrine that the Americans are doing. Yugoslavia doctrine was supporting the insurgent groups, terrorist groups, militant groups, and make them fight against each other to weaken the regime so much that ultimately NATO and Americans would move in with a limited military strike and collapse, make the regime collapse. This is what they're about to do now, but they have not been able to do. They have just backed off a little. They were almost on the verge of going to attack Syria, but they stopped at the last second because of a very harsh stand by Russia. Because you see, Gazprom...
So that's what I want to know, that don't you think that now things have slightly changed? It might not be that easy for US or UK to go ahead and have military strikes on any Muslim world.
This is for the first time that the Russian strategic interests have been so badly, so violently threatened. And the Gazprom, interestingly, also has, Mr. Putin, the president of Russia, also has his own personal shares in the Gazprom as well. So there's also personal vested interest involved as well. And if Gazprom deal is cancelled, if the Russians are not able to push their pipeline through Russia, if the regime is through Syria, and the regime is changed in Syria, that would mean for the entire 21st century, Russia would lose all its influence in the greater Muslim Middle East. All pro-Russian regimes have been destroyed. Saddam Hussein was pro-Russia, he was destroyed. Gaddafi was pro-Russia, he's been destroyed. Bashar al-Assad is the only Arab pro-Russian regime left. And that has to be destroyed for the Americans, for the Israelis, and must be protected at all costs for the Russians. That's why this particular conflict has the ingredients to become a global war. So
we talked about Russia's interest in Syria. Now what's the catch of China? What's the interest of China in Syria? Why is he taking a stand for Syria?
It's basically an anti-American stand. It's basically energy. It's basically not giving too much strength to the American and the Western forces in the greater Muslim Middle East, which are the heartland of the world, not just the Muslims. As all the waterways go through it, all the gas and energy and the fuel fields are there, all the pipelines go through there. So that is itself a competition between the China and the Russia. And China also knows that whatever maneuvering that the Americans are doing in the world are actually not just to contain Russia or also to contain China. So you find a strategic alliance between Chinese and Russians over this issue, because Chinese also want to push their trading. The Silk Route always started from China and went to Europe.
So China has its economic interest as well. So we have two, Russia and China, vetoing in UN. We have two people there. Now third factor, third country, Iran, that is supporting Syria. What's the catch of Iran?
You see, Iran is on multiple axes. One is they're pro-Russians. They needed some superpower to be on their back when they were confronting the Americans and the West. Obviously, every small country wants another superpower, a neighborhood bully to be behind their back. And Russians and Chinese are two neighborhood bullies which Iran definitely wants to be in the back. Second is the Iran's stance against the Saudis on the sectarian lines, on sectarian grounds. The same stance that we saw during the first Gulf War between Iran and Iraq, the same stance that we are seeing in Bahrain, the same stance that we are seeing in Yemen, the same stance that we are seeing now in Syria, that the government, the regime is pro-Iran Shia, and the opposition which is being supported, the rebels are being supported by Saudis. It's a sectarian divide also now. Basically it all started on pipelines, all started on the protection of Israel, the grand strategic objectives that the US have defined for themselves. But to achieve those objectives, you need to play on the ethnic and sectarian axis. You need to exploit the sectarian divides, the ethnic divide, the linguistic divides, divide the Muslim world according to their terms on bloodlines. Kurdistan, Baluchistan, divide the Muslim world onto different communities also. So this is just one axis. Iran is involved in Syria not just because of its gas pipeline. Iran also has a gas pipeline which they need to push through, but also on sectarian lines.
On sectarian lines. And do you think that Iran also finds Syria as a belt, as a protective belt, in front of him, with Lebanon, Hezbollah's belt, and then Syria, and then it's Iran? So if Syria goes down, the next turn would be Iran. That's why it's supporting to have some protection line in front of him?
Again, it's a very complex geopolitics. Saddam Hussein was an enemy of Iran. And when Saddam Hussein was fighting Iran, the entire Western world and Americans were supporting Saddam. But when Saddam became an enemy of the Americans, Iran actually sided and supported the Americans to bring down Saddam Hussein. So here you saw the Americans and Iran actually acting as allies against Saddam Hussein, a common threat, common enemy of both of them. So these geopolitics are really complex, because sometimes Iran actually seems to be against the Americans, but on certain axes they actually cooperate with the Americans also when they have a common enemy between them. So, but as far as Syria is concerned, I personally have no doubt that once the Syrian regime is down, once the Syrian crisis is over, the next target would be Pakistan, not Iran. And there are many reasons to believe this, because Americans are simultaneously leaving Afghanistan also. Iran is not a nuclear weapon state. Pakistan is. Iran is a stable country right now. Pakistan is already in a state of anarchy. Iran is a hard nut to crack. Pakistan has become soft now because of a corrupt government, incompetent leadership, because of terrorism and violence that's going through in Pakistan, and because of the American presence in Afghanistan. They have an opportunity to, and in 1990, once the Soviet-Afghan war was over, Americans imposed sanctions on Pakistan. And I have personally no doubt that once the Americans do not need Pakistan for Afghanistan, for their supply lines and air routes that they're using now, sanctions would be imposed on Pakistan, Pakistan would be encircled, and Pakistan's nuclear program would be ruthlessly targeted. That's the last standing block left for the security and defense of Israel in the grand strategic objectives of US foreign policy.
Thank you very much, Zaid Hamid. We're out of time here. Viewers, as you saw our discussion on Middle East, and then we try to focus on Syrian crisis, we will be bringing out the Middle East crisis on every Sunday so that we can have a clear understanding as to what's happening there. Let's hope that Syria hands over the chemical weapons, as Bashar al-Assad has said, and let's hope that this issue gets resolved politically, not through any military strike, as U.S. is saying, and we might see it as a threat, but let's hope that things get better through political dialogues. Viewers, that's it for today, and inshallah see you next Sunday. We will bring you a lot more on Middle East crisis on Sunday again. Allah Hafiz and good night.